Welcome to the Ghost Stories of the Battles YouTube channel, where we uncover the chilling tales of haunted battlefields. In this episode, we explore the mysterious and eerie stories surrounding Camp Pendleton, a Marine Corps base with a legacy of valor, sacrifice, and, perhaps, lingering spirits. These 4 stories of spectral encounters, tied deeply to its wartime past, are bound to captivate and terrify you. Stay with us as we unravel these ghostly mysteries and step into a world where history refused to stay buried. What happens when the echoes of war refuse to fade? The battlefields and bases of the past often carry more than memories. They carry whispers of those who never left. Camp Pendleton, established during the throes of World War II, is no exception. While it stands as a testament to military might and preparedness, beneath its training grounds and quiet hills lies a world steeped in supernatural folklore. Perched on California's southern coast, Camp Pendleton stretches across over 125,000 acres of hills, beaches, and forests. To the outside world, it's a thriving hub of military activity. But many who have lived and worked here report eerie encounters that defy explanation. From the spectral cries of soldiers to the unsettling presence of unseen entities, Camp Pendleton has earned its reputation as one of the most haunted military installations in the United States. Story 1. The Phantom Sentinel of Margarita Peak. Margarita Peak, an isolated trail in Camp Pendleton's northern expanse, rises like a ghostly sentinel from the rolling hills. Its rugged beauty, often cloaked in dense fog, has captivated hikers and adventurers for years. But beneath its serene exterior lies a darker reputation. Stories of ghostly encounters and unexplained phenomena have dogged the peak since the base's establishment during World War II. Alan Summers, a seasoned hiker and amateur historian, had always dismissed the supernatural rumors. "The stories sounded like campfire tales to me," Alan said. "I went up there to explore its history, not to find ghosts." But what Alan experienced on Margarita Peak turned his skepticism into something he could never fully explain. It was a chilly March morning when Alan began his hike. The sun struggled to pierce through the marine layer, casting the landscape in a gray, muted glow. As he parked his car at the trailhead, Alan noticed how unnervingly quiet it was. Even the usual chirping of birds seemed absent, leaving only the crunch of his boots on the gravel path. The air felt heavy, Alan later recounted. It wasn't just the fog. It was like the entire mountain was holding its breath. The trail wound through scrubby chaparral and weathered boulders, with visibility narrowing as the fog thickened. Alan carried a small backpack with a notebook and camera, intending to document old markers and remnants from the site's wartime use. He had researched how Margarita Peak had been a critical training ground during World War II, where young Marines prepared for the grueling battles of the Pacific Theater. Back then, they used this mountain to simulate harsh conditions, Alan explained. But some of those exercises turned deadly. He was determined to uncover more about those forgotten stories, but what he found went far beyond history. Halfway up the trail, Alan stopped to catch his breath. The fog was so dense that the trail ahead was nearly invisible. Then, faintly at first, he heard the crunch of gravel, footsteps echoing from above. "I thought it was another hiker," Alan said. "So," I called out. No response. He resumed his climb. His curiosity piqued. The footsteps grew louder, yet no figure emerged from the mist. When Alan reached a clearing near the summit, his pulse quickened. There, standing at the cliff's edge, was a man. He wore a Marine uniform, but something was off. The fabric looked weathered, its edges frayed, as if it had been left to the elements for decades. His posture was rigid, almost ceremonial, with his back to Alan and his gaze fixed on the foggy abyss beyond the cliff. I remember thinking, why would someone wear an old uniform out here? Alan said. He called out again, louder this time. "Hey, are you okay?" The figure didn't move. Alan stepped closer, heart pounding. As he neared, he noticed the man's boots. They were caked with mud, but not the fresh kind. This mud was dry and cracked, as if it belonged to another time. When Alan was within 10 feet of the figure, the man finally turned. The Marine's face was pale, almost translucent, and his expression carried a haunting sadness. His eyes, hollow and distant, locked onto Alan's for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, the Marine raised his hand in a solemn salute. I froze. Alan admitted. I wanted to speak to ask who he was, but I couldn't move. The fog swirled around them as the Marine held his salute. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure dissolved into the mist. Alan staggered backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I don't know how to explain it, he said. He was just gone. A shaken but determined, Alan descended the mountain and immediately dove into research. He scoured records at local libraries and Camp Pendleton's archives, searching for any clue about the ghostly Marine. Eventually, he uncovered an incident from 1943. A young Marine named Private Thomas Greaves had died during a training exercise on Margarita Peak. Greaves had been separated from his unit in heavy fog and fell from a cliff while trying to find his way back. His body wasn't discovered until days later, and the incident was quietly filed away as a tragic accident. The description of Greaves matched the figure I saw, Alan said, right down to the uniform. Despite his fear, Alan felt compelled to return to Margarita Peak. This time, he brought a friend, Mark, who shared his interest in history. Together, they retraced Alan's steps, the fog once again thickening as they climbed. The first half of the hike was uneventful, but as they neared the summit, the temperature dropped sharply. It was like walking into a freezer, Mark said. Then came the footsteps, soft at first, then louder, echoing from somewhere ahead. When they reached the clearing, both men froze. There he was again, the Marine, standing at the cliff's edge, just as Alan had described. Mark, a skeptic, stepped forward. Hey, we're just here to learn, he said, his voice trembling. The Marine turned to face them, his gaze filled with the same haunting sorrow Alan had seen before. This time, something changed. The Marine pointed toward the ground near the cliff, then faded into the mist. Alan and Mark approached the spot, their hands trembling. They found nothing but a patch of earth, barren and cold. Later, Alan wondered if the spirit of Private Greaves was trying to tell them something, perhaps guiding them to the place where he had fallen. Alan has not returned to Margarita Peak since that day. I don't think he means any harm, Alan said. But I also think he's stuck there, standing watch over a moment that never ended for him. The story of Private Greaves, and the countless other Marines who trained and sacrificed on Margarita Peak, remains a poignant reminder of the cost of duty. The mountain stands as a silent sentinel, its fog carrying the whispers of those who can't let go. As the fog of Margarita Peak continues to hold its secrets, the haunted barracks of Camp San Onofre beckon with stories of restless spirits and chilling encounters. Story Tori, the haunted barracks of Camp San Onofre. A Camp San Onofre's barracks stand as weathered relics of World War II, their peeling paint and creaking floors hinting at decades of use and secrets. Built to house Marines preparing for war, the barracks have long since been relegated to storage and occasional training drills. But even as their original purpose fades into history, the stories remain. Whispers of ghostly footsteps, shadowy figures, and a suffocating presence that lingers after dark. Sergeant Michael Carter, stationed at Camp Pendleton in the late 1980s, considered himself a realist. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories, Carter said. But what I experienced in those barracks, there's no other explanation. The barracks were assigned to Carter during a training rotation. His job was straightforward: secure the building, ensure no unauthorized personnel entered, and report any maintenance issues. The first night seemed uneventful, though Carter noted the eerie silence. It was too quiet, he recalled. You expect to hear the wind, the creak of the old pipes, but it felt like the whole building was holding its breath. On the second night, Carter heard what he thought was a door slamming down the hall. "I figured it was just the wind," he said. But when he checked, all the doors were closed and locked. Shrugging it off, he returned to his post, but the sense of unease lingered. By the fourth night, Carter's nerves were fraying. Every shift brought new disturbances: muffled voices, footsteps pacing the hallways, and shadows darting just beyond his line of sight. "At first, I thought it was one of the guys messing with me," Carter said. But there was never anyone there. The most unsettling incident occurred when Carter was inspecting the second-floor storage room. As he entered, the temperature dropped sharply and the air grew thick. His flashlight flickered, and the faint scent of antiseptic wafted through the room. A smell he later learned was associated with the barracks, used as a wartime infirmary. "I heard this soft tapping sound, like someone drumming their fingers on a table," Carter said. But there wasn't any furniture in the room. When the tapping stopped, Carter felt a sudden, overwhelming presence behind him. "It was like someone was standing right there," he said. But when I turned around, the room was empty. The following night brought the most terrifying encounter. Carter was patrolling the ground floor when he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning, he spotted a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway. It wasn't like a person standing in the shadows. It was the shadow, Carter explained. It had no features, just this dark, humanoid shape. The figure didn't move, and neither did Carter. For what felt like minutes, they stood in a silent standoff. Then, slowly, the shadow began to glide toward him. "I couldn't move," Carter said. "It was like my body was frozen." As the figure neared, the air grew colder, and a low whisper filled the hallway. Words Carter couldn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissolved into the darkness. The next day, Carter confided in a fellow Marine who had also been stationed at the barracks. To his surprise, the Marine didn't laugh or dismiss his story. Instead, he nodded knowingly. "Yeah, that place is haunted," the Marine said. "Didn't you know? During World War II, it was used as a makeshift infirmary for wounded soldiers. A lot of them didn't make it." Carter's research confirmed the story. The barracks had been repurposed as a field hospital during the war, treating Marines injured in training and returning from combat. Records showed that several soldiers had died there, their names quietly added to casualty lists, and their stories largely forgotten. "Maybe they're still there," Carter said. Stuck in that building, unable to move on. Determined to face his fears, Carter volunteered for another night shift. This time, he came prepared, with a flashlight, a Bible, and the resolve to confront whatever was haunting the barracks. The night began uneventfully, but around midnight the disturbances started again. Doors creaked open and shut, faint footsteps echoed down the halls, and the unmistakable sound of a woman sobbing reached his ears. Carter followed the sounds to the second floor, where he found the storage room door ajar. As he stepped inside, the temperature plummeted, and his flashlight dimmed. I asked, "Who's there?" Carter said, "I don't know why. I didn't really expect an answer." But an answer came. A voice, soft and distant, whispered, "Help me." Carter felt a wave of sorrow wash over him. He didn't see the shadowy figure this time, but he felt its presence, heavy and suffocating. Clutching the Bible, he began to recite a prayer. Slowly, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the room grew warmer. Carter finished his shift without further incident, but the experience stayed with him. "I think whatever's there isn't evil," he said. "It's just stuck. Maybe they're waiting for something, or someone, to acknowledge them." He shared his story with others, many of whom admitted to experiencing similar phenomena. To this day, the barracks remain a source of fascination and fear for those stationed at Camp Pendleton. The haunted barracks of Camp San Onofre stand as a testament to the sacrifices of war, not just on the battlefield but in the quiet, forgotten corners where lives were cut short. Carter's experience reminds us that the past is never truly gone. It lingers, waiting to be heard. While the barracks of Camp San Onofre hold the weight of unresolved sorrow, the lonely stretch of Basilone Road echoes with tales of spectral guardians and eerie encounters. Story 3. The Echoes of Basilone Road. Basilone Road is a name etched into the heart of Camp Pendleton, honoring the legendary Marine Corps hero John Basilone, a Medal of Honor recipient. Stretching through miles of open terrain, it serves as both a tribute to his bravery and a critical artery connecting the base's training areas. By day, the road seems ordinary enough, lined with sparse trees and bordered by open fields. But by night, it transforms into something else entirely. Emily Harper, a civilian contractor who worked late shifts on the base, described her first encounter with the road's haunted reputation. "I had heard stories from the Marines," she said. "They joke about ghosts, strange lights, and things you couldn't explain. I didn't believe them. Until that night. It was a quiet Thursday evening, and Emily was driving home after a long day overseeing supply logistics at the base's southern outpost. The road was eerily deserted, the only illumination coming from her car's headlights. As she made her way down Basilone Road, she noticed how the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. "There's something about that road at night," Emily said. "It feels like you're driving into a void, like you'll never reach the end." Her car radio was off, and the only sound was the hum of her tires on the pavement. Then, faintly at first, she heard something else. A rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on the roof of her car. "I thought it was just my imagination," she said. But the sound grew louder. As Emily rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated a figure walking along the roadside. The man wore a faded Marine uniform, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. Concerned, Emily slowed her car and rolled down her window. "Do you need a ride?" she called out. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head slightly, and Emily caught a glimpse of his face. Pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through her. Before she could react, the figure vanished. "Slammed on the brakes," Emily recalled. "I looked around, but there was no one there, just empty road and darkness." Emily's pulse raced as she continued driving, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She tried to rationalize what she had seen. A trick of the light, perhaps, or exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But then, her car radio crackled to life. "I hadn't turned it on," Emily said. "But suddenly, there was this static and then I heard a voice. The voice was faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. 'Keep going,' it whispered." Emily's heart pounded. She reached for the radio knob, but before she could touch it, the static stopped, leaving only an eerie silence. Determined to prove she wasn't losing her mind, Emily returned to Basilone Road the following week. This time, she drove with the windows down, her eyes scanning the roadside for any sign of the ghostly figure. As she approached the same bend, she noticed something strange in the adjacent field, a cluster of faint, glowing lights moving in erratic patterns. "At first, I thought it was fireflies," Emily said. "But these lights were bigger, and they didn't behave like anything I'd ever seen." She pulled over and stepped out of her car, the cool night air sending shivers down her spine. The lights hovered just above the ground, weaving through the field as if following an invisible path. Then she heard it, a faint chorus of voices. Too distant to make out the words, but unmistakably human. As Emily stood frozen, a sudden gust of wind rushed past her, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder and earth. She turned back to her car, only to find the same Marine figure standing on the road behind her. "I couldn't breathe," Emily said. "He was just standing there, staring at me." This time, the figure raised a hand and pointed toward the field. Following his gesture, Emily saw something she hadn't noticed before: an old, rusted plaque partially hidden by overgrown grass. She walked toward it cautiously, the lights fading as she approached. The plaque commemorated a convoy ambushed on Barcelona Road during World War II, with several Marines killed in the attack. Their names were etched into the metal, a somber reminder of the sacrifices made on this unassuming stretch of road. When Emily turned back, the Marine was gone. Emily's discovery led her to dig deeper into the road's history. She learned that during the war, Barcelona Road had been a key supply route, often targeted by enemy forces. One infamous incident involved a convoy ambushed while transporting munitions to a nearby training facility. The story goes that the Marines fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. Emily explained. Some say their spirits still guard the road, ensuring no one forgets their sacrifice. Emily's encounters left her shaken but profoundly moved. I don't think what I saw was meant to scare me, she said. It felt more like a reminder, a way of saying, we're still here. To this day, she avoids driving Barcelona Road at night, not out of fear, but out of respect. That road isn't just pavement, Emily said. It's a memorial, whether people realize it or not. Barcelona Road remains a vital artery on Camp Pendleton, its dark history hidden beneath its modern purpose. But for those who travel its lonely stretches at night, the echoes of the past are impossible to ignore. The road whispers of sacrifice and service, and perhaps, the enduring bond between the living and the dead. While Barcelona Road carries the echoes of duty and sacrifice, the windswept plains of LZ Horse Field reveal a haunting vision of platoons that march on, long after their time has passed. Story 4 Tree. The Spirit Platoon of LZ Horse Field, a vast, windswept plain used for helicopter landings and military drills, is one of Camp Pendleton's most remote and haunting locations. Its wide, open spaces and distant hills make it feel desolate during the day and unnervingly empty at night. Over the decades, soldiers stationed at the field have whispered tales of ghostly apparitions. Entire platoons performing drills under the moonlight, only to vanish without a trace. Colonel James Hayes, a seasoned Marine with 30 years of service, dismissed these stories as folklore. I've heard my share of ghost tales on bases, Hayes said, but this one I experienced for myself. In the fall of 1995, Colonel Hayes oversaw a late-night training exercise at LZ Horse Field. The night was moonlit but cold, with a sharp wind cutting across the open expanse. The exercise involved several squads, practicing helicopter extractions, with Hayes coordinating movements from a nearby tent. It was a routine drill, Hayes recalled. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least not at first. As the exercise progressed, Hayes noticed something unusual on the far side of the field. A group of soldiers appeared to be performing drills, their movements precise and synchronized. At first, I thought it was another unit, Hayes said. But something about them didn't sit right. Their uniforms looked off, like they belonged to another era. Hayes grabbed his binoculars for a closer look. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The soldiers were wearing World War II era uniforms, their faces indistinct and their movements almost mechanical. They moved like a machine, Hayes said. Perfectly in sync, not a single misstep. But their faces, it was like looking at shadows. As Hayes approached, the air grew colder, and a strange stillness settled over the field. When he was within 50 yards of the platoon, they suddenly stopped. One soldier turned to face him, raising his hand in what seemed like a salute. And then, without a sound, the entire group faded into the night. Shaken but determined, Hayes returned to the command tent and questioned his team about the mysterious platoon. No other units had been scheduled to train at LZ Horse Field that night, and the perimeter guards reported no unauthorized personnel entering the area. It didn't make any sense, Hayes said. If they weren't part of our exercise, who were they? Over the next few days, Hayes dug into the field's history. He discovered that LZ Horse Field had been used as an emergency landing site during World War II. and the site of several training accidents. One tragic incident involved a platoon caught in a sudden helicopter crash during a nighttime drill. All the soldiers perished, and the accident was quietly buried in military records. "Hit me then," Hayes said. "What if those soldiers were the ones I saw? Still performing their drills, stuck in that moment forever." Several weeks later, Hayes returned to LZ Horse Field for another nighttime exercise. This time, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the exercise progressed, the same ghostly platoon appeared, this time closer to the main training area. Hayes decided to approach them again, accompanied by a junior officer. "We were maybe 20 yards away when it happened," Hayes said. "The air got colder, and the wind stopped completely. It was like time froze." One of the soldiers turned to face them, his hollow eyes locking onto Hayes. Then, in a voice that sounded both distant and clear, he whispered, "Not safe." Hayes and the officer froze as the apparition pointed toward the helicopter landing zone. Moments later, a powerful gust of wind swept across the field, scattering their papers and equipment. When they turned back, the platoon had vanished. Later that night, one of the helicopters malfunctioned during landing, narrowly avoiding a catastrophic crash. Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly platoon had been trying to warn them. The final encounter occurred during a twilight drill months later. This time, Hayes and his entire unit witnessed the ghostly platoon. It was just after sunset, Hayes said. The sky was this deep orange, and the shadows were long. That's when they appeared, right in the middle of the field. The ghostly soldiers marched in formation, their boots making no sound on the earth. Hayes instructed his unit to hold their position and watch. Their movements were flawless, Hayes said. It was like they were performing for us. And then, one by one, they stopped and turned to face us. The soldiers raised their hands in a synchronized salute, holding the gesture for what felt like an eternity. Then, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, so did they. Hayes delved deeper into the history of LZ Horsefield and discovered accounts from other Marines who had witnessed similar phenomena. Many believed the ghostly platoon was a remnant of the soldiers who had died there during training accidents. Some say they're stuck because they never completed their mission, Hayes said. Others think they're still protecting us, watching over the field to prevent more tragedies. Hayes left Camp Pendleton years later, but often reflected on his experiences at LZ Horsefield. "I've seen a lot in my career," he said, "but nothing compares to that. Those men are still out there, doing what they were trained to do." For the Marines who train at LZ Horsefield today, the stories of the ghostly platoon serve as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who came before. The ghostly platoon of LZ Horsefield remains one of Camp Pendleton's most enduring mysteries. Their presence is a haunting reminder of the cost of preparation and the bonds of duty that transcend life and death. As Hayes put it, "Some people might call it a ghost story, but I think it's more than that. It's a story about honor, sacrifice, and a duty that never ends." Camp Pendleton, with its rich history and enduring legacy, is more than just a Marine base. It is a place where the past and present intertwine. From the lonely trails of Margarita Peak to the haunted barracks and roads, these stories remind us that the cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield. Have you ever visited Camp Pendleton or experienced something unexplainable at a historic site? Share your stories in the comments, and let us know if you've encountered the paranormal. Until next time, remember, the echoes of war may never fade, and the spirits of history are closer than you think.